Well, our topic this week is knowledge or to know. This is one of the largest and most challenging and most ubiquitous of philosophical questions. There is a whole field, if you want to call it that, of philosophy called epistemology, coming from the Greek word episteme, knowledge, which deals with this question. This is one of the perennial questions of philosophy, question of knowledge. We start with the Webster's definition, the 1828 Webster's definition of knowledge. It's quite interesting how the different senses give, perhaps have different ambitions. If we look at the first sense of knowledge, a clear and certain perception of that which exists, or of truth and fact, the perception of the connection and agreement or disagreement and repugnancy of our ideas. It's very 1828. I love it. That's pretty good. And being pretty good is also shows you how it's pretty bad. I mean, this is so utterly sort of circular that it's kind of useless. But that's what happens when you actually try to define what it means to know or what knowledge is. You can't help but beg the question. What do you mean by clear and certain perception? How do I know when my perceptions are clear and certain? I mean, it's beautiful. It's so useless. It's beautiful. But then we move down to, let's say, the third one, skill as a knowledge of seamanship. That couldn't be any more acceptable and clear, right? I mean, people either have a knowledge of seamanship, and they can be, sailors, or they don't, and it's pretty easy to see who knows seamanship and who doesn't, as opposed to the first one where anything goes, really. I mean, So I wanted to build that ambiguity of different senses into this week's reading. I mean, when I think of knowledge, or in that third sense, I can't help but think of what London cab drivers have to go through to be certified. And they even call it the knowledge. I think it's the knowledge of London is the more complete. But if you hear London cab drivers talk about the knowledge, everyone knows what it is. It's the knowledge that you have to have of the city of London in order to be a cab driver. And it's incredibly difficult because, not only is London a big city, but, the way that they name their streets is different from, say, New York, where, they have this grid system. And, Fifth Avenue goes on for a really long time, but my understanding of the topography of London is not like that. All these little streets. What is the estimate here that to actually pass this test, or it's really a series of tests, that you have to know about 25,000 different streets, which is crazy, man. I mean, 25,000 streets. There's nothing. I mean, downtown Manhattan, sort of like South Philly, it gets a little more complicated, but I don't know if there's anything that compares to that in even New York City, but we don't really like, we can tell, or we could tell, the London cab driver who has knowledge from the one who doesn't. I mean, it's something that you have. So, which is to say, and there's a lot of interesting things about this article too, because it's really about whether, in our day, when you have GPS and things like that, and soon self-driving cars, whether something like the knowledge will become extinct, because you just don't need it anymore. Whereas at one point, a cab driver who had the knowledge was a very valuable thing. That is to have that knowledge, to have the memories of those places, and to be able to navigate London like that was a huge of huge value. Any case, Yes, there's all sorts of things I want to introduce to you this week. If we look at, the idea of self-evident truth, the idea of logical truth, the idea of, and a very famous thing in the American Declaration of Independence, the notion of self-evidence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, et cetera, et cetera. We think of knowledge. We don't know things really in the same, all things that we don't know in the same way. Self-evident truth or logical truth are things that we know without checking, things that have to be true, necessary truths. Aristotle was a great one for pointing out the principle of contradiction, also known as the principle of non-contradiction. The idea that the same statement can't be both true and false at the same time in the same sense seems to be something that would have to be true, and that, like all supposedly self-evident truths, or truths that are axiomatic, there are things that you would accept as true without proof, because once you understood them, you would also see that they need to be true. And there's a long, history of whether there aren't really such things. If you're a thoroughgoing empiricist, that is, this is referred to here at the end of the Britannica entry on axiom. Those who deny the possibility of all non-empirical knowledge naturally hold that every axiom is ultimately based on observation. That would be to be a thoroughgoing and radical empiricist. That is, that there are no truths of reason or things that we simply know because their truth is obvious. That if everything's based on observation, then everything's empirical knowledge, and then everything would be subject to this incredible text by Bertrand Russell, chapter 1 of his Problems of Philosophy, one of the really most helpful, readable, greatest books in philosophy ever written, 1912. Russell's Appearance and Reality seems to me to be a great introduction to the problem of knowledge, and also just of philosophy in general. But his analysis of thinking about his table, thinking about what he knows about his writing table, especially its color and shape, and especially its color, is really quite something. The notion that when you ask what color is this table, in a way it's obvious, it's brown. But in a way it's not obvious at all, because its color would seem to change according to conditions and according to the placement of the observer, so that he is driven to conclude that the question, what color is the table, doesn't really have an answer. Well, it depends. There's no one color that the table has, because the color of the table is so much a matter of a complex matter of the relationship between the observer and the object observed. But he is, really driven here to say that our knowledge of all physical objects is really inferential, in the sense that once we make this distinction between appearance and reality, how something appears to me as opposed to the way it actually is, then even the very existence, much less the properties of physical objects, is something that I infer from the sense data, what he calls the sense data, the immediate impressions that I get when I observe physical objects, that I can be sure of those. That is, I can be sure of how something appears to me. But to say that something is apart from me, and to say how it is an inference that I make on the basis of my sense impressions, which leaves open, of course, the possibility, since that inference is, as questionable as any inference I might make psychologically, is always the possibility that I don't know anything, really, that my inference is wrong.